All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into the staggering findings of the World Inequality Report 2026. We're going to completely unpack the true scale of the modern economic divide. I am super excited to guide you through this because really, understanding our world has to start with looking clearly at the numbers that define it. The researchers have crunched a massive amount of data to show us not just how much wealth is concentrated at the very top, but how that concentration literally ripples out to affect everything, from our climate all the way to the health of our democracies.
So, we're exploring 5 key takeaways today. Number 1, the extreme wealth divide. 2, gender and climate inequalities. 3, the global financial engine. 4, fractured democracies. And 5, the idea that inequality is a choice. Let's get right into it.
Section 1, the extreme wealth divide. Let's start with the baseline reality of our modern economy. Now, we all know that inequality exists, right? But what does the absolute extreme edge of that divide actually look like when you put numbers to it? It's one thing to throw around the word inequality, but it is a whole other thing to grasp the physical scale of it across the globe. Okay, try to picture a mid-sized sports stadium. You know, one that holds just about 60,000 people. If you look around that stadium, you are looking at the ultra-wealthy top 0.001% of humanity. That is it. Just 60,000 multimillionaires and billionaires. Keep that stadium in your mind for a second. Because here is where the shock really sets in. Those 60,000 individuals sitting in that single stadium, they control 3 times more wealth than the entire bottom 50% of the global population combined. I mean, wow, that's 60,000 people holding triple the wealth of 4 billion people. And the report shows this share has just kept growing, from almost 4% back in 1995 to over 6% today. It's a rapid, persistent acceleration of wealth right at the absolute top. Expanding outward from that elite stadium, the top 10% globally own nearly 75% of all wealth. That leaves a mere 2% of the entire world's wealth for the poorest half of humanity to try and share among themselves. So the big takeaway here is that our global economy is structured in a way where an overwhelming majority of resources are just captured by a tiny, tiny fraction of the population. It leaves billions of people with absolutely zero financial buffer. Section 2, gender and climate inequalities. But you know, inequality isn't just about bank accounts, is it? It invades every single aspect of our lives. For instance, when we look at standard economic labor, women appear to earn 61% of what men make per hourly income. Now, that's already a huge gap. But the report points out that this metric completely ignores a massive, hidden layer of invisible work that literally forms the backbone of our societies. So what happens when we actually factor in domestic and care labor? You know, the unpaid household tasks, the cooking, the care work that overwhelmingly falls on women's shoulders? Well, when we account for all of that, women actually work an average of 53 hours a week, compared to just 43 hours for men. Because they're working way more total hours, but getting paid for fewer of them, their true hourly earnings completely plunge down to just 32% of a man's hourly income. It's a total double burden. More work, vastly lower returns. And a remarkably similar double standard exists when we talk about climate change. When we look at greenhouse gas emissions tied to private capital ownership, which, by the way, accounts for about 60% of total emissions, the wealthiest 10% are responsible for an overwhelming 77% of those emissions. Meanwhile, the poorest half of the global population, they contribute a tiny, barely there 3%. The climate crisis is just intricately, deeply tied to the concentration of wealth. And the consequences are entirely inverted. As the report's foreword starkly points out, this is a profoundly unequal distribution of risk. The bottom 50%, the exact people emitting the absolute least, they bear about 75% of global climate-driven income losses. Those emitting the most have the wealth to just insulate themselves, while those emitting the least take the absolute worst of the climate shocks. Moving on to Section 3, the global financial engine. So you have to wonder, what is the invisible engine driving this massive divide year after year? The report outlines that it's built on something called an exorbitant privilege. This is such a fascinating concept. Basically, it's a rigged international financial structure that inherently favors wealthy economies. It allows rich countries to act as global financial rentiers, which just means they profit heavily off owning wealth rather than making goods. They can persistently borrow money at super low costs, all while investing in higher yielding assets abroad. And the researchers make it very clear. This isn't just some natural market dynamic. This is by political and institutional design. Because of this structural setup, the whole global financial system acts like a giant vacuum. Every single year, about 1% of global GDP flows from poorer developing nations straight into richer nations. To put that into perspective, that outward drain is roughly 3 times the amount of global development aid going in the opposite direction. It's wild. Developing nations are stuck facing expensive debt and outward wealth transfers, while rich nations just reap all the excess yields. And obviously, this has a devastating human cost. This outward drain completely strangles a developing nation's ability to invest in its own people. Why this matters is perfectly captured when you look at education spending. Because of this lack of fiscal space, there's an astonishing 35-fold gap in education investment. Sub-Saharan Africa can only spend about €200 per child on education, whereas Europe spends over €7,400 per child. This massive human capital divide basically ensures that today's inequality of opportunity just becomes tomorrow's inequality of outcome. Which brings us to Section 4, Fractured Democracies. Now, you might be asking yourself, if the system is so heavily rigged against the majority, why on earth isn't there massive unified political pushback? Well, the answer lies in our fractured democracies. The report maps out how the clear, class-based voting coalitions of the 20th century, where lower-income voters generally just backed redistributive policies, have basically broken apart. Today, the electorate is split by really deep geographic and educational divides. Highly educated lower-income voters might vote one way, while less educated higher-income voters vote totally differently. Plus, massive gaps have opened up between huge metropolitan centers and smaller towns, which completely fractures the social cohesion you'd need to push for unified reform. And compounding this fractured electorate is the outsized influence of wealth in politics. In a lot of advanced democracies, campaign financing is just heavily concentrated at the very top. The richest 10% of citizens completely dominate political donations. This systematically amplifies elite voices and severely marginalizes working-class representation. It makes it incredibly difficult to pass any laws that would actually level the economic playing field. Finally, Section 5, Inequality is a choice. This brings us to probably the most crucial, empowering revelation of this entire explainer. Extreme inequality is not some accident of market dynamics. Look at how the ultra-rich escape taxation. For most of the population, effective income tax rates rise steadily as you earn more. Makes sense, right? But at the very top, the system becomes totally regressive, and rates just plummet for billionaires. Actually, scratch that. It's not just a drop, it's a massive dive. The report's authors highlight this as a deliberate policy failure that actively deprives society of critical resources we desperately need for education, healthcare, and climate adaptation. But here's the good news. Because these are policy failures, they can be fixed by policy successes. The report explicitly points out that fixing this requires global coordination, progressive taxation, and targeted minimum wealth taxes on multimillionaires. The authors argue that mobilizing these resources is entirely feasible. We just need the political will to actually enact top-end tax justice. As the report's coordinators forcefully conclude, inequality is not destiny, but choice. Fairer and more sustainable societies are within reach. The staggering disparities we've walked through today, from the 60,000 people holding 3 times the wealth of half the planet, to the invisible gender labor gaps, to the massive climate divides, they are the result of deliberate institutional design, meaning we absolutely possess the collective political power to redesign them. So, the ultimate takeaway I want to leave you with is this. The data is crystal clear. The solutions are sitting right there on the table, and the mechanisms of change are known. If inequality is truly a choice, what will we choose next? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really encourage you to keep questioning the numbers that are shaping our world.